On the screen now, Ron, we see a picture of a rather lovely chair that you've made, and this chair has several back slats. I believe you're going to demonstrate to us how you make that back slat, or how you affix that back slat to the rest of the chair.
This is the top rail of the chair. Now this is finished. It starts out as a blank that is solid. In this case, it was walnut. That was about 1 3/4 thick by this long and this high. And so you do all these processes to it. There's mortising on the end, and there's the mortising underneath for the back slats that fit into it. And so you're doing all that while it's still in this rectangular solid so that you have a reference surface. And so what I'm going to do now is show you how I have made these. Mm-hmm. Now, the first step was to have a template made here. And this was something where I actually sent this piece of plexiglass to a friend of mine's shop that had a milling machine, and they located each one of these little squares right as I laid it out to them. Then I affixed it to this block, and therefore that is the jig that I use. These are all in a very slight curve that follows the curve of the back, of the top rail of the chair. So what I'm going to do now is demonstrate with the plunge router how these are cut out. The plunge router has on the bottom of it an inlay jig, and it basically makes it so that it follows around this particular template and cuts out this hole. And so it's really just a matter of laying that out, getting it set, using your template and getting your template properly located. And then really, if you've done everything correctly and you've laid it out correctly, then it's totally controlled. All you really have to do is make sure that once you've done it, that you examine it to make sure you didn't leave any pieces behind or something like that. So as you can see, that's made about a 1/2 inch deep by 5/8 by 5/8 shallow mortise there. And this 1/8 of an inch cutter will leave a little, 1/16 of an inch radius rounded corner, because it's a round cutter. And that works out with the back slat. That is 5/8 by 5/8, and it has already had a 1/16 of an inch router bit go, radius router bit go along the edges of this, so that when it's all done, and I'll just take the template out of the way so you can get a better view, so that this will fit right into that mortise. And so that gets repeated on all 5 of these mortises for the back slats. And then once that particular process is done, then this can go on and have the band sawing, where it's cut out to the curvature for the top rail of the chair. And then there's also a curvature on this part. So there's a whole nother step of router jigs and fixtures for that process. And this mortising for the mortise that and the floating tenon that you see here, this has already been done on this piece, and you can see where that was laid out there. This particular piece is a scrap piece that I use to lay things out, to get all the dimensions and make sure the jig is in the mortising that I'm doing is right where I want it. And then I just substitute the real, hardwood that I'm using for that. Because once you stick in the good wood, you have to have everything ready to go. Now, on the patterns for these, the patterns for the back slats of the chairs and the back posts, those were all done, just by myself, eyeballing them on, a piece of 1/4 inch MDF, and working it until I get the exact shape that I want, and then that becomes my master pattern. So whether you're farming it out or whether you're doing it all by hand, it doesn't really matter. The main thing is that whatever you end up with as your master pattern is going to be what you use throughout the process as replicating that, because chairs are one of the few things that I do that in fact are a production item. I mean, you're making, in this case I made 8 chairs, so you're going to be making these 40 of these. So there's a certain amount of, once you get the pattern down, then it's really a matter of just sort of cranking through them and making sure that the everything fits for on the master pattern, and then everything else is just replicated from there.
Excellent. Good. Thank you, Ron. So tell us what we're going to be watching here, Ron.
Well, this is a mortising table that is part of this combination machine that I have. And the mortising table allows me to take and put a slot mortise, that is to say, it basically has a cutter, a round cutter that will plunge in here and then go along a fixed distance and leave essentially an elongated hole. And the process is one in which you end up with a mortise in this. This will be like the blank for a tapered leg, like on the chairs. And so this will have a mortise in it, and then the front rail will also have a mortise in it, and then there's what's called the floating tenon that acts as the joint between the two mortises. So with this tool, instead of having a traditional tenon on the end of something, I end up with like this, where you have, for example, a table leg like this, where you have a slot mortise in it, and then you have a mortise in the end of this piece, and then with this floating tenon that you can generate by the running foot and then just cut to fit, this will slide into here, and then that joins together like so. So this particular operation is identical to this. The only thing that's different is it's a different diameter, a different length, and so on. And you can adjust where you want this mortise in this leg. So I can adjust the table up and down and all that sort of stuff to get exactly where I've done it. And I've already set this up for this particular piece. So the disclaimer is that in order to do the filming, this mortising table, the chuck for this is literally attached to the end of the joiner and planer cutter head. So there's knives whirring around here that normally would be covered for safety purposes. So this is really just a matter of plunging in and going side to side a few times to get the mortise. Okay, so there's my slot mortise, and I do an identical one on the end of the front rail, and then there's a piece of stock that has been put through the router table that will fit right in there, and that's the floating tenon. So the two parts will go together, and essentially that's the joint between the front rail and the leg. So now we have a mortise, two mortises, and the floating tenon is what goes in there to connect these two. And so I've already generated the stock for that, and this can be made literally by, like I said before, by the running foot, and you just run it through the router table to put this half round on both sides, and you literally just size it to this. So whatever length of this mortise that you make, you cut this to fit, and it can be whatever size you want. I mean, it's almost like you don't need to measure, you just make sure that it fits properly. So those two will go together, and that right there is the equivalent of the mortise and tenon joint, only in this case there's a mortise and a floating tenon. And when you glue that together, that will be an extremely strong joint. A mortise and tenon joint is, for this application, is the strongest joint that you want to use. So that is the basis for doing most of the joinery that you see on these chairs. And on some of the side rails, I'll actually take this table and I'll add onto it an elevated and angled table that has an angled stop to get compound angles. So this right here that I've shown you this is 90 degree, but sometimes these things are at angles like this for the side rails of the chairs, and they're also not 90 degrees not only this way, but this way. So this is coming in straight. Sometimes these are going to come in at an angle like that. So depending on how you set up your mortising table with different jigs, you can get different angles, and you can get infinite sizes of mortises depending on the size of the diameter of the cutter head and the width of the piece.
So if somebody in their own workshop, Ron, doesn't have one of these sophisticated bits of machinery, a mortising table, what can they do to create a similar joint?
This is actually easily done, well, relatively easily, with a plunge router. And you can set this up where you can imagine sitting this in a vise and then having like it would be the equivalent of a little table that sits on top of this, in which case you have a plunge router that it's the distance from whatever face you're registering off of, in this case the front face, that it's, you've set it up so it's all this distance from the front, and then this distance so you're setting up stops and guides for your plunge router to use. So, it's a little more work to set up and make the jig, but it's certainly doable.
Possible.
You end up with the exact same mortise. The plunge router will accomplish the exact same thing, just not as quick as doing something like this.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Good demonstration. Interesting.